Welcome to the Debunkers podcast. Okay, let's dive into something that sounds simple on the surface, but is, frankly, an absolute mess underneath. The dream of a made-in-the-USA iPhone. And buckle up, because forget putting a little flight sticker on the box and calling it a day.
Yeah, it's definitely more complex than sourcing some, patriotic adhesive. Our sources make it abundantly clear this isn't just a manufacturing challenge.
Yeah.
It's a labyrinth of economics, labor, technology, and even politics.
Our mission today is to navigate that labyrinth with you. We're going to figure out why building iPhones stateside isn't quite as easy as, say, screwing in millions of tiny screws.
Right.
Which, by the way, is an image straight out of our sources. We'll dig into the eye-watering costs, the surprising realities of the American workforce, the limitations of robots.
Yes, robots are involved.
The global supply chains tangled up with tariffs, the political spin, and even whether your green iPhone is actually green.
It's a deep dive into the gap between the aspirational idea of domestic production and the gritty, complicated reality the numbers and the experts reveal. And trust us, it's a reality worth understanding.
Okay, let's kick this off with the big, shiny idea put forth by a U.S. Commerce Secretary in one source that the army of millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones could somehow rematerialize in America. Sounds quaintly industrial, doesn't it?
It does paint a picture, yeah. Even if, that official was actually talking about the scale of automation needed, not necessarily armies of people with screwdrivers. But anyway, the sources quickly bring that vision crashing back to earth when you look at the economics.
Absolutely, because then you turn to the analysts to actually track Apple's manufacturing costs. And the consensus is pretty blunt. They universally agree that making iPhones in the U.S. is, at best, highly expensive, and at worst, a fairy tale that is not feasible.
Fairy tale. Ouch.
Fairy tale.
Yeah. And they put numbers on that bluntness. One estimate suggests just the labor costs alone could push the iPhone price up by, 25%?
25% just for labor.
Yeah.
And another analyst threw out a specific hypothetical number, $3,500.
$3,500.
For a U.S.-made iPhone. Wait, $3,500? For an iPhone? My wallet just wept.
I know, right? And it gets worse. Another estimate, factoring in potential tariffs alongside labor, projected a whopping 91% price increase on something like an iPhone 16 Pro Max.
91%.
Yeah, that's essentially doubling the price.
Okay, that puts the highly expensive label into perspective. And when you compare that to current production, most iPhones are made in China, where labor costs are reportedly up to 70% less than in the U.S.
Exactly. And it's not just the hourly wage. China has established enormous economies of scale, enabling this high-volume, low-unit cost production that's just really hard to beat.
And that army of millions idea. The sources point out that Apple's main partner, Foxconn, employs up to 900,000 people in peak season. 900,000.
Across massive campuses that basically function as small cities. Dorms, shuttles, the whole thing. They can scale up and pivot production with incredible speed.
Trying to replicate that kind of scale, that speed, and that highly specialized workforce expertise here in the U.S., according to the sources, that's a much bigger undertaking. Something that would likely take many years, if even possible. It's not exactly something you spin up next quarter.
Right. So if the cost difference is that stark, largely driven by labor, why isn't the U.S. workforce just, lining up for these potential jobs, even if they paid really well?
Well, this is where the sources reveal a pretty significant structural issue. It turns out the biggest hurdle isn't just the cost of U.S. labor, but the simple fact that the U.S. doesn't have the same type or availability of workforce setup ready to go for this kind of mass electronics assembly.
You mean we're not just sitting around waiting to screw in tiny screws?
Apparently not in the volume needed, no. There's a documented structural labor shortage in U.S. manufacturing overall.
We're talking nearly half of projected positions potentially unfilled by 2033. The manufacturing workforce is aging out, and younger Americans, perhaps surprisingly, just aren't that drawn to traditional factory work.
Even with a potential patriotic appeal.
Well, the data is interesting here. While about 80% of Americans broadly support manufacturing in the U.S., only about a quarter actually want these jobs for themselves. There's a bit of a somebody else should do it vibe there,
And here's where it gets really insightful, I thought. The quality of manufacturing jobs themselves has changed. That image of the old union-protected, pension-backed jobs that built the middle class.
Right, the classic image.
Largely gone. Modern manufacturing jobs often offer less compensation and stability than alternatives. It's not just the pay rate, it's the whole package.
And it goes deeper than just willingness, too. Apple CEO Tim Cook himself reportedly told a U.S. Commerce Secretary that the U.S. simply lacks enough skilled workers for the incredibly detailed, precise tasks needed.
Skilled workers specifically.
Yes. He's quoted saying that in China, you can fill football fields with skilled manufacturing workers, but in the U.S., it's hard to even fill one meeting room with the required talent.
Wow. Okay.
That highlights a pretty fundamental difference in the available talent pool for this specific kind of work.
Okay, so if labor is expensive and there's a skill/availability gap, maybe robots are the answer. Automation to the rescue? Sort of.
Automation is definitely part of the conversation for U.S. manufacturing competitiveness. I mean, to offset higher labor costs and standards, U.S. factories are investing heavily in it.
Yeah.
We saw a 15% growth in the U.S. industrial robotics market in 2023, and over 70% of U.S. factories have reportedly adopted some level of smart manufacturing.
And automation can help offset labor costs, right?
No.
Through precision and efficiency. Companies like Adidas and Ford, they've built highly automated facilities to try and make production here feasible.
Oh.
But here's the reality check the sources provide. When Ford invested $1.2 billion to modernize a plant, it added just 130 jobs.
130. That example really illustrates the template for modern manufacturing mentioned in the sources, doesn't it? It creates high economic value, yes, but the employment profile is just dramatically different from the mass factory jobs of the past. You're not seeing thousands of assembly line workers.
Yeah.
You're seeing dozens or maybe a couple of hundred highly skilled technicians running the machines.
Which brings us back to that quote about needing robotic arms at a scale and a precision for Apple. It sounds like we're just waiting for the right, super precise robots to show up.
Well, it's not quite that simple, or maybe it is that simple, depending on how you look at it. The sources point out that modern manufacturing isn't just about replacing manual dexterity with robots.
Right.
It requires STEM knowledge, programming skills, systems thinking, to manage that automation. There's a significant skills mismatch that our education system and workforce training haven't fully caught up with yet.
So you don't just need people to turn screws. You need people to program the robots that turn the screws and maintain them and design the systems.
Exactly. And the analyst view is that even if Apple could shift some production over, say, the next 5 years, it would definitely involve automating processes heavily to deal with that U.S. skill gap. They might even need to change the iPhone's design itself to make it more robot-friendly. Apparently, those tiny screws are particularly problematic for current automation.
Who knew the humble little screw was such a bottleneck?
Oh.
Okay, so moving beyond labor and automation, you hit the brick wall of the global supply chain.
Oh, yeah. Apple has spent decades building this incredibly intricate system, primarily centered in China. It's described in the sources as a sprawling system of plants tailored specifically for assembling electronics.
Tailored specifically.
And a massive network of Chinese suppliers and factories that can't be easily replaced. It's not just a generic factory floor, it's a finely tuned ecosystem.
So you can't just unplug the Chinese supply chain and plug it into, say, Ohio.
Not according to the sources, no. Moving the entire iPhone supply chain, the components, the sub-assemblies, the specialized tools, the raw materials, that would be a much bigger undertaking.
Right.
And it would likely take many years, if even possible. It's built piece by piece over decades, and it's not a one-size-fits-all system you can simply relocate.
And then you throw in the political wrenches, like the Trump administration's threat of a 25% tariff on iPhones unless they're made in the U.S. That adds a whole other layer of complication.
Tariffs like that certainly increase costs, complicate logistics, and will ultimately hurt consumers through higher prices. Sources note tariffs on parts alone could raise prices significantly.
This raises an important question, though. How do global companies actually respond to those pressures? Do they rush to bring manufacturing home?
Well, Apple's response, according to Tim Cook's statements referenced in the sources, isn't necessarily to jump to the U.S. He stated that the majority of U.S.-bound iPhones are expected to be shipped from India, specifically to evade tariffs on China, apparently. India production could ramp up to 60-65%.
So the tactic to avoid tariffs meant to incentivize U.S. production is to make them somewhere else besides China. that's a response.
It seems shifting production to other established manufacturing hubs like India or Vietnam, which also ramped up during Trump's first term, or even Brazil.
Oh, Brazil too.
Yeah, where Apple makes a specific model, the iPhone 16, to avoid tariffs there. That seems to be a much more feasible and likely path than bringing it all the way back to the U.S., given the existing infrastructure elsewhere.
And let's not forget the literal brains of the operation, the chips. Taiwan's TSMC, the world's leading semiconductor manufacturer and a critical Apple supplier.
Absolutely critical.
They have their own geopolitical rules. Their most advanced chip production processes have to stay in Taiwan, with overseas facilities a generation behind.
So even if you built an assembly plant in the U.S., you still wouldn't get the absolute cutting-edge chip manufacturing here, at least according to TSMC's current rules. The tech itself has strings attached.
Okay, so this conversation isn't just about economics and manufacturing nuts and bolts. It's very much a political hot potato, isn't it? Tossed back and forth between administrations.
Absolutely. The sources we reviewed present a pretty clear contrast in records and approaches between the Trump and Biden-Harris administrations when it comes to manufacturing.
According to one source, under the Biden-Harris administration, more than 775,000 manufacturing jobs have been added since January 2021, exceeding pre-pandemic levels.
Right.
They highlight laws like the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, and the GFES, which aims to boost domestic semiconductor production, projecting these, could add over 336,000 manufacturing jobs per year.
This source points to investments focused on areas like clean tech, domestic supply chains with initiatives like Buy Clean and Buy America, and efforts to bring jobs to disadvantaged communities. Construction spending on manufacturing facilities has seen a significant increase under these policies.
Contrast that with the picture painted of the Trump administration in this source, where more than 200,000 manufacturing jobs were reportedly lost, with growth plateauing even before the pandemic hit.
And looking ahead, this source suggests Trump's potential future plans, maybe outlined in frameworks like the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, could involve eliminating programs supporting manufacturing growth and industrial decarbonization.
Really?
Yeah, prioritizing outsourcing to Central or South America, they call this rehemisphering, and valuing productivity gains over job numbers, potentially leading to significant job losses, like 1.7 million by 2030, according to their analysis.
We even saw specific anecdotes presented to illustrate the approaches. One source highlights Trump claiming a deal saved jobs at a carrier plant, but hundreds were still cut.
Right, I remember that.
And conditions were described as relentless.
On the other hand, the same source celebrates President Biden joining a United Auto Workers, that's UAW, picket line, and marking the reopening of a Stellantis plant for EV battery production as a promise kept.
So the sources present very different pictures. One showing recent, correlated job growth and targeted investment in specific manufacturing sectors like clean energy and chips under current policies. And the other highlighting past losses and future plans that could lead to more outsourcing and job reduction, at least as interpreted by these particular sources. We're just laying out what the material says, obviously not endorsing any specific political viewpoint here.
Exactly. And finally, layered on top of the economics, the labor, the technology, and the politics, there's the environmental angle.
Ah, yes, Apple's favorite topic. They love to promote their green credentials, don't they? Even hiring Mother Nature herself, played by a famous actor, naturally to audit their progress in those slick commercials.
Right. They've touted carbon-neutral Apple Watch models with specific bands because, details matter, and have a big pledge for net zero climate impact per device by 2030. They say they're pushing suppliers to use clean energy.
But critics, like Greenpeace, as cited in the sources, aren't letting Apple completely off the hook. They point out that these initiatives, well, maybe positive steps, shouldn't distract from the overall environmental footprint. The vast majority of a phone's carbon emissions, like 81 to 84%, happen during the manufacturing stage.
And critical suppliers like Foxconn assembling the phones and TSMC making the chips still have surprisingly low renewable energy ratios, below 11%, according to these sources.
A low 11%.
Yeah. So pushing suppliers towards clean energy is presented more as a lofty goal than a widespread reality right now.
This does make you wonder, is the green push genuinely integrated into their core business, or is some of it just a well-timed marketing strategy, as one source puts it?
Whoa.
Critics note Apple's aggressive, often incremental product launch cycle encourages frequent upgrades, which seems fundamentally counter to minimizing environmental impact from manufacturing, right?
It does seem like a contradiction. And then you have a company like Fairphone, which is built explicitly around ethical practices, worker well-being, and environmental sustainability.
Fairphone, right.
They make phones that are actually repairable with a regular screwdriver and offer a 5-year warranty.
A regular screwdriver. You need specialized tools and often glued down parts to even open an iPhone, let alone fix it, and the standard warranty is just 1 year. That Fairphone example is a pretty stark contrast.
Fairphone's CEO talks about,
And it raises the question, is that complexity, that challenge of reshaping a global, sometimes ethically murky system, another reason why bringing manufacturing back isn't just about cost or labor, but about fundamentally rebuilding an entire philosophy of production.
it's a tangled knot, indeed. It really is.
So what does this deep dive tell us about the dream of a made-in-the-USA iPhone?
Yeah.
It's clear it's not just a simple manufacturing question. It's a dense weave of economic realities, labor market challenges, technological requirements,
Decades-old global supply chains.
competing political visions, and even the environmental impact. And yes, apparently Mother Nature is taking notes on your phone's carbon footprint.
The vision of that army of millions is likely giving way to a future of highly automated, high-tech production if U.S. manufacturing does grow in electronics.
But that future looks fundamentally different from the factory jobs of the past, requiring different higher-level skills and offering a dramatically different employment landscape. It's just not the same picture.
No, and the sources make it seem highly unlikely, perhaps even impossible in the near term, to move the entire operation back to the U.S. without, well, potentially tripling the price of your phone if you don't solve the automation and skill gaps first.
Right.
And companies like Apple are already reacting to protectionist policies like tariffs by shifting production to other global hubs like India rather than necessarily bringing it home.
This leaves us with a pretty significant question to ponder, I think.
Yeah.
If the future of U.S. manufacturing is increasingly automated, highly skilled, and perhaps less labor-intensive per unit than the past, what does the political promise of bringing manufacturing back truly mean for the average American worker today? And what should be the actual achievable goals of policies aimed at domestic production?
Yeah, what does success even look like in that context?
Something to chew on until next time.
It seems our time for today is wrapping up.
We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive.
It's always great having your input and thoughts.
But sadly, it seems we've run out of time for today.
Thank you so much for listening and for being such an engaged part of our podcast.
We always value your participation.
Until our next deep dive together.
Goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time.